All right. Well, welcome to Key, everybody. How's everyone feeling? Are we doing all right on this Thursday evening? That is pitiful. Do it again. Come on now. Is anybody excited about what God is doing in this place tonight? That's what I'm talking about. That's the energy I'm talking about, people. Hey, it is great to see each and every one of you. If it is your first time here with us, welcome. If you're already a part of the family, welcome back. We are so thankful for each and every one of you. And hey, I wanna do something we haven't done in a second here. So if you would, in the most creepy way that you possibly can, turn to your neighbor and say, I was praying I would sit next to you. And then once you figure out who you didn't pick first because they weren't your first choice, turn to your other neighbor and ask them, did we just become best friends? All right. Quit trying to date the person next to you. Quit trying to date the person next to you. Hey, if you want to, it's fine. But, all right. Well, hey, last week we started a brand new collection of conversations called To the Ends of the Earth. And it's a study that we're gonna be doing through the book of Jonah over the course of the next several weeks. And I don't know about you guys, but after Jonah chapter 1, I feel very much like I resonate with Jonah on an even deeper level after studying through the very first chapter of Jonah. Anybody else feel that way? Like our life is incredibly similar in ways that I don't even necessarily want, and certainly not in ways that I had ever planned on. But I'm excited to jump into Jonah chapter 2 together this evening as well, because last week we spent a lot of time where we were talking at length about how you and I have the propensity to run from and to resist God, but also what we found is that in our brokenness we sin. And in our brokenness and sinfulness, many times what we think is that we can find the abundant life outside of the author of life. And so thankfully, we also talked last week about how God, despite our best attempts to ruin our lives, whether we know that we're doing it or we have no idea we're in the process of doing that, God has the propensity to rescue and to redeem. And so I'm excited to be jumping into Jonah chapter 2, where we see that that is God's very heart. That chapter 2 here is flooded, no pun intended, but it is flooded with the beautiful reality of God's grace extended to you and me and at work within us. And so I wanna pray, and then let's jump into everything that God has for us. Will you pray with me? Lord, I thank you for every person that is in this place tonight. Lord, I know that everybody comes in here and they've all got their own things that they're working through, things that are difficult, things that maybe make them feel like they're coming to a realization that they've been running from you and that they've been struggling in their relationship with you. Maybe it's just a lot of busyness or distraction, but God, in these next few moments, I pray that we would be able to just center our mind around your word, God, that your word would be at work in our hearts, that whether we know you, Lord, or not, that we would feel your grace not only extended to us, but at work within us. Lord, I pray that you would do with our time what only you can do. We ask these things in Jesus' name, amen. Well, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Louis Zamperini's story. Maybe you've read Laura Hillenbrand's book called Unbroken. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for quite some time, and maybe you didn't read the book, but maybe you saw Angelina Jolie's film adaptation of Louis Zamperini's story that went by the same name, Unbroken. But if you haven't, it's this crazy story of faith and survival. Louis Zamperini grew up as a really wild child in Torrance, California. He was always in trouble with his family or his teachers, and oftentimes he'd even be in trouble with the law. And so early on in his life, he decided that he was gonna channel all of his energy into athletics, and he found that he excelled in that, particularly as a runner, as a track star, that we saw that I know, easy Justin Bieber, but all of us, like we saw that Louis Zamperini was somebody who set the California state record for the mile in high school. He landed a scholarship to the University of Southern California. And when he got to USC, he was so prolific as a runner that he even got to run in the 1936 Olympic Games. And he planned on running in the 1940 Olympic Games as well, but he ended up being drafted to fight in World War II after Europe broke out in war. And so he ended up joining the United States Air Corps as a bombardier, and as he did, on May 27th, 1943, his plane was performing a rescue operation over the Pacific Ocean, but that ended up experiencing some engine failure as they were flying over the Pacific. And as that happened, they had to make an emergency crash landing in the ocean. And so as the plane hit the water, Louis Zamperini ended up finding himself in a position where he was entangled in wires from the plane, and he passed out. And somehow, he must not have obviously been passed out for very long. He woke up and realized that he was no longer entangled in the wires, so he kicked to the surface where he was able to find a very small raft, and he and 2 remaining survivors ended up floating adrift at sea in the Pacific Ocean for the next 47 days, where they were starved, exhausted, and dehydrated, to the point where one of them even didn't make it as they found themselves floating over the sea over the course of this time. One of them ended up dying. And so after they got to 47 days, they found that there were these Japanese sailors sailing in their waters, and they ended up picking Louis and the only remaining survivor up. And we found that for the next 2 years, Louis Zamperini would spend his time in prisoner of war camps. And when they found out he was an Olympian, rather than having him executed, they just had him repeatedly tortured and used as propaganda. But thankfully, whenever the war ended, he was set free and he was able to go back home to the United States. And what's amazing is, as Louis Zamperini tells this story, he goes through all the craziness, right? But that's not really the main thing that he remembers. He talks about how the plane goes down, he's in the water, he's entangled for a moment, he finds that he's free, gets back to the surface, and he's in this raft for 47 days in the middle of these awful conditions. But he remembers praying 2 prayers that echoed one another. He prayed to God twice, saying, "Lord, if you would spare my life, then I promise that I will serve you with the rest of my life." And it wasn't until his wife ended up dragging him to a Billy Graham crusade many years later when he would remember that prayer, and he ended up making good on that promise that he had made to God. Now, Louis Zamperini had absolutely no business escaping any of these experiences that should have killed him. I mean, he got knocked out, but he got back up. He was entangled in the wires, but he was somehow set free. That as the plane sank deeper, his consciousness grew stronger. He should have drowned, but he was delivered. He should have been killed, but for whatever reason, he was kept alive. And you can call that whatever you want. You can call that whatever you want. I'd even say go ahead and believe whatever you want. If you're a skeptic and you're in here tonight, for real, believe whatever you want. But it is very difficult to arrive at any kind of conclusion outside of the fact that it is nothing short of miraculous that Louis Zamperini not only lived to share his story, but he was also able to make good on the promise that he had prayed to God. Really what it is that it's nothing short of grace. It's nothing short of grace. And what we see here in Jonah chapter 2 is something very similar. We see that Jonah is in a desperate situation, and the grace of God is extended to him and also at work within him. And the same thing is true of you, and the same thing is true of me. Of all the themes, points, and theological arcs in God's word and in God's story, there are very few that are as important as the reality of God's grace extended to us and at work within us. What is the grace of God? What is grace? Grace, in a really simple way of putting it, grace is desiring to give amazing to the undeserving. Grace is desiring to give amazing to the undeserving. That it is God choosing to bless the very people that deserve the opposite of a blessing. That it's not just God withholding from giving us what we do deserve, which would be God's mercy, but that it's God going the extra mile and giving us what we don't deserve, which would be grace. That grace is not just something God gives, it's the essence of who God is. That at the core of God's very heart, he desires to be compassionate towards us and to give grace. And grace isn't something that we can earn, it's not something that we can deserve, and yet what we see is that God gives it. But if we could earn it or deserve it, Romans 11:6 says, it wouldn't be grace. And so grace is a substance that sets sinners free. It flows from the very heart of God to hurting people. And what we know is that it's something that is given entirely out of who God is, not something that you and I can get based on what we have or have not done. That God gives not what you and I rightly deserve, but out of the depths of his riches. Dane Ortland wrote a book that's really been just speaking to me over the past year. It's called Gentle and Lowly, God's Heart for Sinners and Sufferers. And he had this quote in there that's so good, I just had to share it. I was like, I'm definitely stealing this, Dane. Thank you, Dane. But it says this: the sins of those who belong to God open the floodgates of his heart of compassion for us. The dam breaks. It is not our loveliness that wins his love, it is our unloveliness. He continues and he says, God didn't meet us halfway. He refused to hold back, cautiously assessing our worth. That's not his heart. He and his son took the initiative on terms of grace and grace alone, in defiance of what we deserve. We see that God's grace is defiantly on display here towards Jonah. Anybody else thankful that God's grace is defiantly on display towards you? That God has no reason and is not obligated to be graceful towards us, and yet he is defiant in the face of what we deserve and gives us the very thing we don't deserve, that he gives us grace. I mean, we see Jonah in this moment, he is actively running away from God. Like purposely, we saw that last week. Go to Nineveh that way. Jonah said, actually, I'm going this way. I'm going to Tarshish. I don't care what you want. He's actively running, rebelling and resisting God. And yet we see here that God graciously pursues Jonah. We also talked last week about how you and I are very much like Jonah, that we run, we resist, we rebel, and yet God is able to pluck us up from the depths. We see here in Jonah chapter 2 what Liza just read for us, that it's a prayer, but it's also a poem. This is often referred to actually as Jonah's song. Why? Why is this called Jonah's song? Because when you have experienced the grace of God, your natural response is worship. It's to worship. And anything else would be weird. I mean, Jonah knows this to be a truth. Last week in Jonah 1, we talked about how Jonah keeps going down, and that down is a euphemism for death. If you missed last week, Jonah ends up going down to Joppa, down to the ship, down to the inner parts of the ship, and then finally he lays down to sleep. That he's been moving towards devastation and death. And now in Jonah chapter 2, verse 1, we see for the very first time Jonah prays. Isn't that weird? I mean, we've seen lots of people pray to this point. The pagan sailors have prayed to this point, but we have not seen the prophet of God pray until now, when he gets thrown overboard. Which, if you have a reason to pray, being on your way out of a boat in the middle of a storm ought to get you into a place of prayer. And that's what we see happen here with Jonah. He says in verse 2, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. Jonah has gone down, 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 and now he says that he's crying out of the belly of Sheol. Sheol in Hebrew it's the grave, it's the pit, it's known as the place of the departed dead. It's very similar to what Hades was thought of to the Greeks, very similar. People of antiquity thought that the earth sat on water. That's how they thought things were going in outer space, that no, we're just kind of sitting on water out here in the middle of nowhere, which makes a little bit of sense if you don't know any better. But so their idea of the underworld was that it was this really noisy and watery place, which is exactly and ironically what Jonah is experiencing here. Whether he's in the belly of the whale or he is just out there kind of in the waves and in the sea, it's this noisy, watery place. And so in Jonah's mind, he's been going down as he has moved away from the presence of God towards devastation and death. And now Jonah thinks that he's reached it. He believes that he's in Sheol, or at least well on his way. Because we see that he says here in verse 3, "For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me." After Jonah gets tossed into the sea, he becomes painfully aware that he is where he is as a result of his own actions, as a result of his running, and as a result of his sin. That God's let him get this far and he's just like, go for it, Jonah. Let me know how things go for you. Run from me, let me know how that goes. And we know how that goes. It never goes well. That inevitably, as we move away from God and we're moving towards sin and death, what we find is that sin will always bring us to a place of chaos and calamity. That it never gets us even where we think it might, where we intend to go. Jonah says in verse 3, "Your flood surrounded me. Your waves and your billows passed over me." That in this moment, Jonah is saying, God, these waters are yours. He's attributing and referencing all of the waters back to God in verse 3. He thinks that the flood and the waves, all of the waters are God's discipline against him because he deserves it as a result of his running and his sinning. But watch what happens in verse 4. We start to see a little bit of a turn in the song here. It sounds terrible, terrible, and we get a little bit of a hint of hope in verse 4. It says, "Then I said, I am driven away from your sight, yet I shall again look upon your holy temple." Jonah felt like he had been driven away from God's sight. That he was undeserving of a response from God when Jonah cried out to him. And yet it does not stop Jonah from praying. He says, "Yet I shall again look upon your holy temple." What does that mean? Well, the temple was the place that people would pray in Jerusalem. That's where they would go for prayer. And so it's difficult to say whether or not Jonah believes in this moment that he is physically going to find himself back at a place where he is able to physically in Jerusalem at the temple be praying with people, or if in this moment he's just saying that he's committed to prayer. But that's what we can know for sure, that in this difficult moment, Jonah is committed to prayer despite knowing that he is where he is as a result of his own sin and his own actions. Jonah is committed to call upon the name of the Lord, knowing that he's not deserving of a response, and yet he's gonna do it anyway. And for many of us that are in here tonight, if you don't hear anything else, that's the one thing that you need to take away. That if you feel like you are driven from God's sight, when you feel like you are unworthy and undeserving of a response from God, what do? You call upon him anyway. You call upon the name of the Lord. So often when I talk to people, and I know it to be true in my own life, that I'll find that we typically are slow to go to prayer for a multitude of reasons. Number one, we don't think that God is gonna answer in our timing. Number two, we don't think that God is gonna answer in the way that we want him to answer. And number three, sometimes we just don't think that God is gonna answer us at all. And so we're really slow to move towards prayer because we just think, no, if you knew what I was doing in my running and my sinning, I'm too much of a broken, sinful mess for God to even feel obligated to respond to me in any kind of way. I'm unworthy and undeserving. And here's the reality, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. There's nothing that is in us that God looks down, Almighty God, and is like, I better start doing what he says. I better start doing what she says. They know better. They know stuff. Like, God is not obligated to respond to you or I. But that's the beautiful and amazing thing about God, that he responds graciously to us, not because there's anything worthy in you or in me, but because he's worthy to do as he pleases, and it pleases God to give grace and to respond graciously to those who call upon him. So call upon him. Call upon him. We see in this moment that Jonah calls upon God, and God doesn't answer immediately. In fact, it feels like things are getting worse as Jonah calls upon God. You ever prayed to God and felt like, God, I really need you to show up here, but before it gets better, it feels like it's getting worse? Anybody ever felt that way before? As the waves are cascading over Jonah, things are dark and difficult and worse than they've probably ever seemed at this point in his life. It doesn't seem like things are going well at all. And yet he calls upon God. And it gets to its absolute worst point in verse 5. In verse 5, we're told, the waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head. At the root of the mountains, I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Translation, things are going terrible for Jonah. Terrible. You can't get a much more vivid image of somebody that is in distress, hopeless, or honestly just seems destined for destruction. And obviously, as all of us are in this room right now, nobody in here is literally, physically drowning in the heart of the sea, in the depths of the sea, and you're not sure you're gonna be able to get out of it. Nobody in here is experiencing it in that physical way. But you still may feel like you are drowning nonetheless, where you have been fleeing from the presence of the Lord, where you have been going to your own Tarshish, and you feel like you are drowning in sin, or you are drowning in the byproducts of sin. And maybe for you that looks a little bit different than everybody else in the room. Maybe for you it looks like you've been seeking fulfillment in a relationship that you were never intended to engage in, and certainly not one that you should be staying in. Maybe for you, it's that you have been exercising really poor spending habits, and so you're always telling people you don't have money, but you always have new things because you think that those things are gonna ultimately be able to satisfy something in you to make you feel better about yourself. Maybe it's that you've put your identity in ideologies that are outside of God. Maybe it's that you have been feeding an addiction that tries to numb a brokenness within you that doesn't need to be ignored, but could actually be restored. But whatever it is, when we find ourselves in really difficult, deep, dark moments, usually our initial thing that we wanna do is grasp at programs and principles. That we want to try to outwardly figure out what we need to do, which isn't a bad thing. But we want to find a quick fix. What can I practically take steps towards so that I'm able to figure out how I can get free and stay free? Nothing wrong with that. But it shouldn't be the first thing we do. Because do you notice here that when Jonah finds himself in a deep, dark, difficult spot, what he doesn't do is start implementing a new swimming routine. He's not like, well, the backstroke ought to do it. Like, that's not what he does. He doesn't start thumbing through how to win fish and influence whales. Like, he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. I mean, because why? Why is it that Jonah doesn't do anything like that? Because deliverance does not start by outwardly grasping at programs and principles. It starts by inwardly turning our hearts towards God in prayer. It's not programs and principles that are gonna set you free initially, it's prayer, that freedom is ultimately found not in our best attempts to do things, but when God acts. And so we see here with Jonah that he cries out in a difficult moment. What do you do when you're at your lowest? You do what Jonah does. You call upon the name of the Lord. Not when you feel like you're in a good enough spot with God to where you're worthy of an answer, but when you feel like you're beyond rescue. That's when you call upon the name of the Lord, not just in some circumstances, but in all of them. Look at what happens in verses 6 and 7. Jonah says, "Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God." Not, "Yet I brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God." You did. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Grace is desiring to give the amazing to the undeserving. Jonah is grateful here that God is graceful. Yet you, O Lord, brought my life up from the pit. Do you feel like your life is in the pit? You call upon the name of the Lord. There's not a thing you're gonna be able to do in your own strength. He has to do it in his. We see that God has no reason to rescue Jonah. He doesn't have to. And yet he desires to give the amazing gift of rescue to an undeserving recipient. And it's not just amazing in the way that God gives this amazing gift. It's amazing in the way that he accomplishes it. I'll tell you, when I was just a kid, I might have been like 12 years old at the absolute most. Myself and my best friend at the time, his name's Andrew Warner. Shout out, Andrew, if you're watching this. But my best friend at the time, Andrew and myself, we decided we were gonna go camping. And I'll tell you this, I pride myself on honesty around here, okay? Let's just cut to the chase. You take one look at Andrew and you were like, that guy knows what he's doing if he goes camping. But let's keep it an absolute buck. You take one look at me and you know I'm not Bear Grylls. You know what I mean? Like, you take one look at me and you know that if I'm in the wild and something goes wrong, I'm an absolute liability in the wilderness, okay? I'm not even gonna lie to you. If it's you and me and it's just us and we are stuck out in the wilderness, two things are for sure gonna happen. Number one is that I'm dying, no question about it. I'm gonna die. Number two is that you're gonna die as a result of something I did or did not do unintentionally because I don't know what to do in the woods. That's the other thing that's gonna happen. And so I'm the person Andrew decided to take camping. And we decided that we were gonna meander from his house and we just started walking through this forest. It sounds worse when you say it out loud. We just started walking through this forest, just going wherever the Lord would take us, and we saw that there was this lake that we stumbled upon, and there was a little inlet, and we were like, that looks like a great place to make camp. Let us go forth and prosper. And so we did, and we set up camp there, and the plan was to be there for a whole weekend. The problem was that on night one, we were bit by every creature and critter known to man. And I tried to tough it out, you know what I mean? Look at me, you know what I mean? Like, it just didn't work. It didn't work at all. We woke up, I'm trying not to cry, it's bad. Andrew knows something's wrong with me. I'm like, do we got ointment? He's like, are you serious? I was like, no, I was just checking for you. It was like a bad thing all the way around. And so we decide, you know what, maybe at 12, we're not equipped to be camping out here in the summer in Texas on a lake at an inlet. Who knew? Stuff bites in Texas in the summer. And so we decided that we would go home, and going home was a struggle. I mean, going home, we end up stuck in this bank that's damp. There was clearly a stream that used to be there. I'm like struggling to get out of it. We end up making our way back onto some path that we think leads home, but we don't really know. And as we're going down one side of the trail, and a park ranger is walking down the other side. And as he's walking, he's like, wait a minute, boys, how are you? What's going on? And I don't know what gave it away. It might have been all the bites on our face. It might have just been that we were 12 walking around like we had no idea what was going on. And he's like, hey, what are you doing? And in that immediate moment, I'm not gonna lie to you, my initial impulse was to lie to him and say that we were doing something other than camping, but the whole tent situation on my back would have given it away. So I just said, we're camping. We're camping, why? What's up? You need some tips, tricks, what's going on? And in that moment, he just looked at me and was like, you know there are campsites here, and you can't camp outside of the campsites. The campsites are made for you to camp at. And I was like, no, but that makes sense, doesn't it? And so he just said, hey, follow me. And when he said that, I was just looking down at my feet the whole way. I was just consumed with worry that we were gonna be punished for breaking. I didn't know if this was a rule. Is this like a law? Like, can you get the death penalty for this? Like, what is going on? I'm 12. I'm just like, if I don't get it in real life, my mom's gonna give it to me at home. Like, it's just gonna be bad. And I'm just consumed with this worry. And as we ended up following him, I didn't look up at all until he just said, there you go. And he had brought us to the head of the trail where we had jumped in the day before. And I tell you that because the great irony and the funny thing is that the very thing I was worried about being a punishment ended up being an agent of rescue. That the very person I perceived to be a problem was actually God's grace extended to two stupid 12-year-olds trying to make it through the wilderness, right? And we see here that God does something similar with Jonah. He sends a fish, he sends this whale. That sometimes the very thing you see as a punishment is actually God's grace extended to you. And Jonah's coming to terms with that because it probably doesn't seem like that's the case. When you get thrown overboard and you are flailing about in the water, as soon as you get swallowed by a whale, you're probably not like, this is fine. This is great. This is exactly what I had in mind. No, he said, I feel like I'm in Sheol, man. I feel like I'm dying, I'm on my way. But what he starts to recognize is, that the whale isn't God's wrath, it's his rescue. That the fish is favor, it's God's grace extended to him. He says in verses 8 and 9, those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. He's realizing this is actually a good thing. So he says, but I with the voice of thanksgiving will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Jonah recognizes that in his running and in his resisting, it's been a form of idolatry. That he's not just running from God and resisting God, he's simultaneously running towards and reaching for something other than God. And every single person in here knows what that's like. We all know the feeling of that emptiness within us as we run towards and reach for something other than God. And maybe we wouldn't say it out loud with our lips, but we silently know it to be true in our heart. That often we end up looking to people or to things that are gonna hopefully bring us salvation, deliverance, love, joy, peace, hope. We look to any and all things outside of God to provide that for us, that we make idols out of them. G.K. Chesterton, the great theologian, said, we often use what we should worship and we worship what we should use. And that is exactly what Jonah realizes here. One of the difficult things about running towards and reaching for something other than God is that as we move away from God, thinking that we might find the things that we're looking for in another or in a thing, we end up forsaking the very things that we hope to find that would be there if we just turn to God and not to our idols. In Jonah's day, people would worship and had this whole idolatry wrapped around little trinkets. Like these little carved images, metal images, wooden images, and they thought that there was deity associated with those things. We saw in Jonah chapter 1 that they prayed to their gods, hoping that they would provide some sort of salvation or deliverance, but it doesn't happen, not even close. And it'd be really easy for all of us in this room to be like, man, but we've progressed, bro. What are you talking about? Obviously, we're not as ludicrous as these people of antiquity. We're not gonna worship little metal, little wooden gods and idolize them. We're not that dumb. Science, bro. But I'd say be careful, because we do idolize things still. It just looks a little bit different. If I looked at your screen time right now, it would tell me that you idolize your phone, that you idolize social media. And what's your hope with it? You hope that it will deliver you out of obscurity and out of dislike for yourself. And so rather than working on your own life, you scroll through everybody else's, hoping that somehow your grass is gonna magically be watered by looking at somebody else's yard. Do it with pornography. We hope that it's gonna deliver us into some kind of satisfaction that we can't find, and it's gonna make us feel some semblance of love that we're worried we're never gonna find. We do it with politics. We hope that it's gonna deliver us into some kind of subjective superiority and save us from the evil others. We do it with community. We hope that it's gonna deliver us into acceptance and love, and it's gonna be all of these great things because it's just gonna love us for who we are and not challenge us into being who we're not. We have little idols everywhere that we hope will bring salvation and deliverance. And Jonah rejoices here because he realizes that hope and steadfast love is not gonna be found in idols. It's not gonna be found in running. It's not gonna be found in sinning, but he rejoices with thanksgiving as he finds himself in the belly of this whale, knowing that deliverance and salvation is found in God, who extends grace to people who do not deserve it. God doesn't just pick Jonah up in a whale Uber here. He puts him back on the right path. It says in verse 10, the Lord spoke to the fish and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. I don't know what's going on in your life as you come into this place tonight, but what I do know is this: all of us have fallen short, every single one of us. There's nobody in here that could stand confidently on your own 2 feet and say, you deserve the grace of God, that you're worthy of it. But every single person in here that has experienced the grace of God can confidently stand on 2 feet and tell you that we were not worthy of it, and yet God brought our life up from the pit, that he is worthy to do as he pleases, and it pleases him to give grace, to not only extend it to us, but that it would be at work within us. Why do we worship? Why do we do that? I've had people be like, man, what's up with like the worship and all the excitement and like the lights and all the things? Like, do you hope that you're just gonna you're gonna feel something, or that you're just gonna have some kind of emotional thing, or that you're just gonna have this mind-blowing experience by just freaking out and praising the Lord? And I'm like, you've got it so backwards. We don't worship because we hope something's gonna happen. We worship in response to something that has happened. That's why you worship. And so we don't come in here hoping that something mystical and magical is gonna happen. No, we worship because something concrete has already happened, that in an unfathomable act of scandalous grace, God sent his one and only Son to you and to me. We didn't earn it. We didn't deserve it. There was nothing that we could do as we were drowning in the waves. But God sent something to rescue, not a whale, but a person. He sent his Son, Jesus Christ, to meet us in the middle of the waves that could have consumed our life. But when we should have been killed and dead as a result of our running and rebelling, what ended up happening is in this unbelievably amazing act of grace, we found ourselves worshiping with thanksgiving, saying, "You, O Lord, brought my life up from the pit." And so we're here to worship. And we're gonna continue in worship right now in this moment. And I don't know where you're at, but it is time to call upon the name of the Lord, not when you feel like things are all perfectly lined up in your life, but in this moment as things feel like they are dragging in your life. And so will you stand up and will you worship with us as we continue to praise the Lord together here tonight?